on to TMT Insights. Let's bring up Andy Shenkler. Andy Shenkler, the CEO of TMT Insights, who'll be talking with A+E Networks VP David Klee about cloud-based remote editing and total supply chain transparency and visibility. Andy, over to you.
That was quite a mouthful of a title, but thank you, Steve. Good
Didn't even
afternoon,
take a breath
everybody.
once while saying that.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Shenkler, CEO of TMT Insights, and I'm happy to be joined by David Klee from A&E. So we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the back end of everything with regards to the streaming world. So I know we spend a lot of time focusing in many of these conversations about the experiences, both from a consumer perspective and just kind of how people kind of monetize merchandise, things like that. But of course, a lot of this all begins behind the scenes with the digital supply chain aspect of it. And we've been very fortunate to have a long-term relationship with Dave and the crew at A&E in terms of transforming their supply chain. And so today Dave's gonna talk a little bit about what we've been going through in terms of remote editing and some of the transformation processes there, as well as just kind of what we have for a roadmap perspective and where we see things heading across the industry with a number of our clients and the work that we're doing together. So I will turn it over to Dave, and he will lead us through the first portion of it.
Sounds great. Yeah, thanks a lot, Andy. Great to have an opportunity to talk with everybody and talk a little bit about some of the work we've all been doing together here, moving our media supply chain into the cloud. So hopefully A&E is a name that folks have heard, and if so, it's probably mostly for the content here in the middle. Run several linear cable channels, A&E, History, Lifetime, and a few others. And like many media companies, we've been through a huge transformation, especially over the last 5 years or so, where we've gone from really focusing on those linear cable channels to being, I would argue, a very strong multi-platform company where we're distributing content on a variety of different streaming outlets, moving content into many different applications and services. And while we have some of our own websites and apps, some of our own platforms, we've made an intentional choice over the last few years to not just limit our content, to not just pull our content back to only our platforms, but instead to work with everybody else, which means that we're building integrations and supply chains and tools to get content from our network platforms to so many different people, so many different streaming platforms domestically and around the globe. And when I started about 5 years ago working at A&E, we started talking about what we wanted to accomplish. We sort of knew that we were ready to get started with a new approach for a lot of our media infrastructure and a lot of our media processing. And I had a unique opportunity because I was starting a new department there. So I didn't have a whole bunch of legacy equipment or legacy workflows or systems to help maintain. I could kind of move around and get to know people around the organization and get familiar with what people liked, what people didn't like, what people saw as the opportunities coming up for the company, for media processing at the company, and some of the challenges. And so these are some of the themes that for me really came up and it became really the foundation for what we decided to do next, which was that number one, everybody wanted more agility. Everybody, especially business teams who are working with our content, trying to make good strategic decisions about where our content goes and what platforms it's on and what we're doing with it. People wanted to take advantage of new opportunities. People wanted to be on a new platform or take advantage of a hot topic in the news cycle or make a new type of content. If it made sense for A&E, people wanted to be there, and they wanted to be there very quickly. They wanted to be very agile about taking advantage of these opportunities. And the second theme that kept coming up, and this one was especially from our media operations groups, our internal teams, trying to get content everywhere it needs to go, is that everybody was really tired of sitting in a queue and waiting for things to process. Like very, very tired of sitting around waiting for content to restore out of an old LTO archive, or waiting for these transcoders to go through and get content prepared and ready to go where it needed to. We knew we wanted to work at a higher volume. We knew we wanted to scale up. and be able to process lots of things. But that also meant being able to burst, because we didn't want to just maintain a giant infrastructure forever. And then the third big theme that kept coming up was efficiency. The idea that so many of these workflows and so many of the systems and tools were built for those linear cable channels that I showed at the beginning and the middle. And now we're being asked to handle not just one output or 6 channels worth of linear outputs, but maybe hundreds of different outputs all around the globe. So everybody knew we were being asked for an exponential amount of growth in terms of the amount of content we were processing. But of course, we're not being given an exponential growth in staff to help solve that problem and get everything through the pipeline quicker. So we knew we needed to be more efficient. We knew we needed to be more automated and handle that exponential growth that was already starting 5 years ago, but we could see more and more coming our way. So for each of these things, we sort of came up with a guiding principle to help enable that. For agility, we really focused on building targeted tools that were loosely coupled with each other, tools that would be easy to update and change and make work together over time. We didn't want to build a giant monolith like one big content management system or one big MAM or DAM system that would try to solve all our problems. We wanted a series of tools that solved specific problems well and made sure they talked well to each other. And then for the elasticity bit, we knew we needed to build in the cloud. I mean, there's no other way to get the kind of scale that we wanted, where we're processing, thousands of things one day and not very much the next. We knew that cloud infrastructure and the ability to flex and scale based on volume and needs was a part of our future. We had to get stuff out of our aging infrastructure in our offices and into the cloud. And then third, we really thought about efficiency, and we started to think about a lot of ideas, not just for automation, but for lean manufacturing. A lot of these ideas that have been very popular for supply chains and processing in the manufacturing world, things where you're making refrigerators and cars and microwaves and stuff. Those processes, that idea of manufacturing and supply chain is really very simple at its core. It's take raw materials in, apply a process to them that gives them value, and then in the end you have an output, a finished good or something that people want, and you sell that to them. So the idea, we wanted to take those principles, those very simple ideas of having inputs, applying processes, and getting outputs, and moving that to our media processing world, which is where we got into this concept of media as a supply chain. And so we took our supply chain, we took the processing that different teams were doing, and we started to think of it together as one unified supply chain, as one unified set of steps, where we're getting content in. And for these use cases, most of the time, the content we're getting in is finished programs and movies from the suppliers that we've asked to make it for us. We get that content in, we then need to do some work to it. Often we need to make many different versions of it, a version for linear premieres on cable, and then maybe a version with an extra commercial break for a rerun, versions with different content added in for international use or taken out, different translations. Many different versions get created in that middle during section. And then the outputs, of course, that's where we're getting those versions we've made, all these different episodes of television, all their different versions, distributed to everybody in the formats they need with the metadata they need. So it's in all the streaming services and available to everybody who should be available to. So we really started to think of our supply chain this way of in, during, and out. And we started a lot focusing on inputs and thinking about how to get our content into the cloud when we started building up our supply chain tools. And then we had some great opportunities on outputs where we had some large streaming deals we were trying to make happen, and we were able to automate getting some content out to some major platforms as part of launches. But for a little while there, we would have content coming in the cloud in our new tools. It would come down to the ground, and we would edit it and make these new versions and edit suites and with video editing tools that people would be familiar with. And then it'd come back up into the cloud to get distributed. So about a year ago, we really set out to say, great, we want to make this supply chain totally cloud native from end to end. we want that middle part, that editing part, to come up into the cloud as well. And we kind of want to think about it in a new way for this context of editing for supply chain use cases, editing for reversioning and getting things where they need to go. And you might not think of, like, if you're into video editing, you might think of it more of a creative process. I started as an editor, and I certainly think of it that way. You think about telling a story, and even if you're working with a finished show or movie and trying to make different versions of it, you're still thinking about the story, thinking about how to tie things together, how to make changes to it in order to still make it an effective narrative, an effective story that's going to work well for its use case. So that's a very creative process, but at the same time, there's a lot of stuff in that process that isn't as creative. And so our goal was really to take a step back and think about how this video editing worked for supply chain and take an approach that would make it more friendly for people who are doing that work every day. So relying on those key principles we came up with, number one, we wanted it to be agile because we knew we were going to have different requirements, different needs. We wanted to incorporate different tools over time. We didn't just want to build a thing and then, get into a capital cycle where 5 years from now we'll rebuild it, and 5 years from now we'll rebuild it again. We wanted a thing that could grow and change with us very easily. And we also wanted it to be elastic. Like, we didn't want to be tied to a physical facility with a physical number of edit suites, and you could only schedule somebody to go in and sit in the room, the dark room for the day with their video editing equipment. We wanted to be able to do a lot of content processing when we had a big deal to do, and scale back down and not pay for all of that extra infrastructure when we didn't. And then when it comes to efficiency, we really wanted to automate as much as we can so that editors come in, they have everything ready for them, they have stuff in the right place, it's ready to go. And the editor applies their work, they do their changes, and put it back to the system to do everything else to get things as much as possible that don't need to be done by the editor out of the editor's hands and into the system. So to solve those problems and to build a new thing, we reached out to Andy and our partners at TMT Insights. We engaged with them to help build some of these new automated supply chains and rely on a tool to tie it all together called Polaris, which Andy will talk a little bit more about in a bit, but also explain a little bit about how we used it to tie together the operation. And of course, we're working with our amazing in-house engineering team to build these automations, make things move, and be able to tie it into all of our other systems internally so that everything gets where it needs to go based on our business needs. So this is a little bit about how it came together for us, building this new cloud-based video editing environment to enable these high volume workflows. We have 3 key tools at play that we're relying on. Number one, SDVI Rally is our workflow engine, our orchestration engine. This is a SaaS tool running in the cloud that we've been using for our supply chain workflow since we got started. And it allows us to automate a lot of these workflows, transcode things, scale up and scale down video transcoders and video processing when we need them. And that way we have them when we need them and we're not paying for them when we don't. Then Arch Platform on the right here became another SaaS partner we found to help build our video editing environment in the cloud, which kind of looks and feels like a video editing environment anywhere. It's a workstation with Windows installed and Adobe Premiere and a bunch of creative tools and some storage mounted. You log in, you do your work, and you log out. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And then Polaris is, for us, the system that really ties it together. It takes what we call it our operations management system. It takes all of these things happening in the operation, the automation, the workflows, assigning tasks, tracking status, puts it all together under one pane of glass and one interface so everybody knows what's happening and is able to interact with this complicated automated system. And of course, our A&E engineering teams is not only writing a lot of the automation code, but helping tie this all together with our internal systems. So at a high level, here's a quick diagram of how this has all been coming together for us. It starts with this little androgynous person at computer user. I think that's the name of the icon, which I find funny. These are our users who are working. Most of the people working in our A&E environment on video editing tend to be working at home. We're a very remote friendly organization. So they have their laptop at home, they use a web browser, they log into the Arch platform, and the Arch platform helps connect them to their virtual machine. They see a list of virtual machines that are open and available. They click on one, it logs them in, and that virtual machine is running in AWS, running in the cloud, has Adobe Premiere and all the creative tools installed they need, and it has their media ready to go. It's connected to some shared storage, which is connected to our workflow engine and automation and everything running in the cloud. So when somebody places an order and says, I want to edit a piece of content, they do that in the Polaris order management system. It kicks off a workflow in the Rally orchestration engine. That workflow makes the right content, gets it into a proxy, loads it up onto the shared storage, and links it into a panel in Adobe Premiere. And just to show you that panel quickly, so if you're an editor, then log in and you see in Adobe Premiere this panel. You have a list of tasks when you first log in that tell you the things that you've been asked to work on for the day, the different shows you've been asked to edit. You open it up, your timeline loads, your media got copied in automatically for you. Everything's there and ready to go. You go through and do your edit. And then you also need to fill out some metadata, take some markers from the timeline and mark them in this metadata panel. That way we know all the information about this show, which audio track is which, where every segment starts and stops, where the credits are, all the information that's useful to us to help then automate the use cases downstream. And when you're done with your edit, you're in Adobe Premiere here, you hit complete on this panel. It actually then comes back up into the cloud and it renders back up here in the SDVI Rally cloud ecosystem in AWS. The Adobe Media Encoder actually runs up in the cloud. So the editor worked on a proxy in their Adobe Premiere virtual machine, but when they hit submit, the timeline goes back up into the cloud and it renders off of the high-res media, and we make the new master so the editor doesn't have to watch paint dry and wait for a render to finish. They just move on to their next job and they keep going, and then the system goes through and automates the rest of that workflow.
Which I think
So for
Dave,
go ahead, yeah.
Just interrupts. Beth had a question, and it was related to the cost of doing all of the variants for all of these things. And I think that directly addresses that, which is the whole thing is built around an exception process basis, and the fact that we're using low res or mid res proxies to do the work and not moving heavy assets around between all these environments, but keeping it contiguous to the cloud actually reduces the cost significantly from where it was with all of whether it was on-prem storage and needing SANs and DR and things like that. So it's actually far more economically viable. So just
Yeah, no, totally right. Yeah. The idea here is that you've got a cloud native workflow. So we receive our content from a supplier because they uploaded it to us in the cloud. We get that content loaded onto a virtual machine in the cloud, but it's only a proxy of it. And then the actual high-res asset stayed where it was and renders out a new high-res asset next to it and goes everywhere it needs to go. But that's exactly right. But yeah, Andy, happy to have you talk about how for us, Polaris is sort of the middle of this ecosystem. It's where people start the work, where people continue the work and see the status. Interested to hear from you more about how that came to be and what you've seen in the industry.
Yeah, I mean, the problem statement that we tried to solve with Polaris is not obviously unique to Dave's challenges, but across the industry, which is even when you're looking at this diagram of architecture, which is actually only a small subset of the components that are in the full architecture of the digital supply chain. We're not showing everything here with regards to metadata, title management, underlying rights and avails, right? As you guys are, I'm sure, appreciate, there's just a myriad of systems, both SaaS, homegrown, old, antiquated on-prem environments, and many of those don't even have UIs that are really designed for content operations teams. They may be kind of engineering-esque focused UIs, and may not, kind of tell the whole story. So the whole point of Polaris, to Dave's comment earlier, was a single pane of glass that creates a nomenclature and visibility that also allows for that order management, task management, but reaches into all of those things. So it's not replacing any one of these things. It's kind of bringing a semblance of order to all of it so that we can now enable all of that stuff without people having to know all of the various systems, in nth level of detail. And yeah, this is there's a little mini screenshot of it. You guys are welcome, obviously, to go to our website for a little bit more, and we're happy to engage on it. But the entire point was, how do you start to aggregate, all of that information and make it digestible, right? So when you're doing things like even the orchestration of everything that Dave just laid out with regards to, I need to move assets over to an FSX storage array. I need to notify when it's ready for an editor to action. I need to have communication between editors and producers, and there may be late assets arriving from production companies. The world of, I've got an email, I sent, the thread of the email was one topic, 17 messages later, we're talking about something else, but the thread subject line never changed. There's no auditability to what's happening here. We've now consolidated all of that through one holistic view. And so that's what kind of enables all of that, all of that efficiency, right? So that comment of how do you get exponential growth without having exponential growth in, cost and overhead, it really can only be achieved by kind of putting these things in. And so that's very much why we built it, and we've had a lot of success with Dave and others in putting that in place. It actually, there's on the next slide, we actually have a picture of where that kind of manifests itself then when you start to look at the distribution of all of this content. So, we've been talking about, the singular, so to speak, in terms of like all of the creative workflow of making those edits, compliance edits, and so on and so forth. But we've now, realized the world of the concept of late binding, which has always been kind of the dream, whether it was IMF or even non-IMF, but wanting to achieve it, where you can send out a core video and then subsequently follow it up with subtitles, dubs, closed captions, whatever it happens to be. And, just this picture starts to show you how the change in kind of the philosophy of approach that we've been putting in place together has really started to bring that realization to life. So you've got, unique episodes that you can see these peaks that are happening there, but just during a simple window within that, peak period, there were over 300,000 components that were delivered that make up all of that stuff. Everybody went from a world of wanting fully, muxed assets that were ready to go to wanting to make a Rubik's Cube of anything for everyone. And of course, all the time it'll be like, let's add a logo. There's we have a new marketing logo. We want to do an international logo. And nobody wants to go through the trouble of having to recreate the entire inventory every single time. So really componentizing everything, making it possible for editors to not have to go and put assemblies together of all of that, and then just focusing everyone on the activities that they're doing, that they're great at, and then getting the machines to pick up the heavy lift of what's kind of an arduous task is now coming through with in full fruition. So that's very much kind of how we've approached it. And then that, of course, leads us to, so where do we go from here? And so we've got, a little bit of a combined roadmap of where we're headed. So obviously we're continuing to roll out bulk distribution. That's very much the focus of the next several months, is continuing to onboard all of the different endpoints that we can send to for all of those machinations. AI, clearly the flavor of the year. If anybody looked at NVIDIA stock today, you would see it really popping. So we're continuing to do R&D and tool testing. We're being very judicious about that, right? There's a lot of tools out there, but some may be fly by night and disappear very quickly, and some, may be cool, but then you have a solution in search of a problem. And so we're really trying to hone that in and focus our attention on things. We have ongoing operational enhancements. Those will always be. There should always be iterative improvement to everything you do. Avails and metadata management is, really the next big challenge for all of this, because we have ordering and the mechanism of people being able to go in and say, I need these 500 titles, these 1,000, but what you really want is the triggering of all the rights to generate all of that stuff systemically, and then having people, again, from an exception processing perspective, because just the sheer amount of business growth dictates the fact that it can't just be down to people with spreadsheets. And then, of course, putting the AI enhancements in after all the R&D is done, but really focused around compliance, translation, assembly, all of those things. I think for the last 15 years, if I have to hear one more time somebody talk about replacing a Coke can with a Pepsi can in a video, that's, cool. I don't know what the business use for that is exactly, but if somebody needs one, there's plenty of things out there that'll do it, but we need to find something that allows all of that scalability to really come in place. And then finally, all of this is for naught if we can't integrate with financial systems, because there's royalty reporting, which people will focus a lot of attention on, but whether you're doing things and doing things like billing or split billing between parties and stuff like that, we tend to all talk about the costs of this being the AWS or Google costs, right? It'll be like, well, how much did it cost to transcode? And it's like, well, that's fine, that's a hard cost. But how much did it cost to master? How much did it cost to QC? Did you have to localize? Did you go to a third party? What's the actual, for a sales team, what's the actual cost of manufacturing when you take into account everything that's involved? And does a deal actually make sense to do? If they can forecast that on the fly before they ever actually consummate a deal, so that the rub between sales operations and the sales forces out there can actually know that before manufacturing ever begins, like it fundamentally changes how people are doing deals and executing on them. So that's, it's a fairly large transformation that we're seeing, not just obviously at A&E, but across the industry, that are all looking at these things holistically. So yeah, that's, thank you obviously for your time for all of it. Hope it was somewhat insightful for you guys, and if any questions.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, that was great. It was really great to get a look at the kind of the roadmap at the end there. So we just got a couple of minutes, so I want to jump right into questions. I think you kind of talked around this, and I'm not sure if this one was answered already, but Beth Rosen asks, obviously, is this being done in cloud? Is the revising content for different distribution outlets costing more money each time you have to do that?
I mean, the cost is really just spinning up the environment, which is not very expensive, because we're only focused on it for a very short period of time, and we don't have to spin up something very heavy, because we're not putting 4K assets into the cloud for them to edit. We're putting a rendition of it that they can work with, and then using the back-end cloud processing to handle the 4K stuff. So we're really actually moving around very small components, relatively speaking. And while things like Teradici gives you a really nice GPU accelerated experience, it also means you don't need to use something with that power. You can use CPU based. So it's really down to preferences, distances. We've had environments where we've actually done rendering, the work with people doing editing in India, but the actual instance running in AWS East, right? So we didn't even have to go and put it into different local zones and deal with multi-region. Not to say you can't, but the advent of a lot of this has really made it, pretty beneficial.
Okay, yeah, and I know you talked about Premiere Pro, which always pricks up my ears because I've been a Premiere Pro user for 20 years. But can this be adapted to Apple, iCloud, Final Cut Pro X,
Yeah, the same approaches can work anywhere. We actually played around a little bit with DaVinci, as a opportunity. Internally, we use DaVinci, of course, for higher end color corrections and some other stuff. We have a big Avid shop internally too. We actually have a lot of Avid editors running in Avid's on-demand service, which runs in Azure. So the concepts absolutely work there too, for sure. The nice thing about Premiere is that what we found is there's a much more open architecture for plugins and panels and putting in your own stuff. So if you've got a high volume workflow where you're doing a lot of the same thing, Premiere, I've generally found, gives you the flexibility to set up some customization so that it does it in a way that really is effective for you, but doesn't mean you can't use another editor and can't install that in the environment of your choice as it makes sense.
Okay. Right, and just one more question from Scott Lasky. When creating versions, are you creating placeholder records first, then bringing in the master asset to create the version?
It's a great
Yeah.
question. Yeah, sorry.
You take it, Dave.
Yeah, yes, and no. Yes and no. So we're always making a metadata record first that we need a version for some reason, particular international or non-linear or other domestic use case. And then the edit creates that version. So we are essentially we're using a placeholder style workflow. But the placeholder actually gets created for us in another business system, in a master data system upstream where they manage the titles. They'll say, we need this version up in our master title system. And we'll, as that edit gets finished, ingest it into the cloud and pull all that data in real time so that we have that final record all together at the same time.
And that's where the Polaris piece comes in, because it can see all the way up to that record, even though the asset shell doesn't exist yet. So we have visibility there's no end to where the supply chain runs, right? You can go all the way from green lighting all the way down to distribution and then tie it back financially. That's kind of, we all seem to think about digital supply chains as linear, but in reality, they're a complete circle, right? The whole point is that you're feeding the data back in order to inform who's making productions in the first place based on the data from a consumer perspective, and everything in between should be informed from that as well.
Okay, cool. Yeah, well, this has been great. Thanks so much, David, Andy. Thanks to TMT Insights, A+E Networks, Teradek, and BC Live. Appreciate this. So one last piece of business before we go. The walk-up music was correctly identified by Alan Rogenstein, and that was the Crusaders with Chain Reaction. And so on to our last session of Streaming Media Connect 2024. We'll be back in a half hour at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 1 p.m. Pacific, with successful strategies for growing and monetizing your streaming service. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.